einiger Zeit ist sie in der Leitung des Liberal Arts Programms der Columbia University tätig und vermittelt damit den Studierenden verschiedenster Disziplinen die Relevanz der Philosophie, vor allen Dingen des antiken Denkens. Ihr wissenschaftliches Werk umfasst inzwischen eine große Fülle von Monographien und Artikeln zur Philosophie der Antike, zur Anthropologie, zur Ethik und Handlungstheorie, die in den hochkarätigsten Verlagen und wissenschaftlichen Zeitschriften erschienen sind. Für ihre wissenschaftlichen Verdienste hat sie zahlreiche Auszeichnungen erhalten und wird regelmäßig zu Forschungsaufenthalten in der ganzen Welt eingeladen. Aus vielen Erzählungen weiß ich, wie sehr ihr die Förderung des wissenschaftlichen Nachwuchses, besonders von Frauen und Menschen anderer Kulturen, ein besonderes Anliegen ist. Und sie referiert auch dabei immer wieder auf ihren akademischen Lehrer Friedo Ricken, der wie kaum ein anderer Professor der Hochschule viele Schülerinnen und Schüler gefördert hat, die heute als Professorinnen und Professoren tätig sind. Ich erinnere mich sehr gerne noch an den Vortrag von Katja Vogt und die Diskussion mit den vielen Schülerinnen und Schülern von Friedo Ricken zu seinem 85. Geburtstag im Juli 2019, wo er noch diesen Tag sehr genießen konnte im Kreis seiner Schülerinnen und Schüler, bevor er dann wenige Monate später auch geistig deutlich abgebaut hat und dann 2021 verstorben ist. Ihr heutiger Vortrag mit dem Titel ist Immortality, Choiceworthy, widmet sie sich der uralten philosophischen Frage, ob der Tod ein Übel bzw. Unsterblichkeit ein erstrebenswertes Ziel ist. Im philosophischen Diskurs wurde diese Frage über die Jahrhunderte hinweg mehrheitlich mit der Auffassung vertreten, dass Unsterblichkeit nicht unbedingt erstrebenswert ist. Ein endloses Leben würde irgendwann langweilig werden oder von Anfang an bedeutungslos sein. Heute ist in den Zeiten von Longevity, Langlebigkeit, ist das ein regelrechter Trend und für viele dieses Ziel der Unsterblichkeit oder zumindest eines sehr, sehr langen Lebens ein übergeordnetes Lebensziel. Vor diesem Hintergrund ist die Frage des heutigen Vortrages hochaktuell und es ist sehr schön, dass Katja Vogt mit der Wahl dieses Themas auch ihren Doktorvater Friedo Ricken in besonderer Weise ehren will. Das macht uns klar, dass wir als Hochschule für Philosophie, wenn wir in diesem Jahr 100 Jahre feiern, sehr auf dem Fundament stehen, das viele Persönlichkeiten aus dem Jesuitenorden in den letzten Jahren errichtet haben, in den letzten Jahren, Jahrzehnten errichtet haben. Wir haben das Jubiläum, wie bereits gesagt, mit dem Festakt an den Alumnus Alfred Dell begonnen. Und es ist schön, wenn Professorin Vogt heute mit der Widmung des Vortrags an Friedo Ricken ausdrücklich an eine weitere Persönlichkeit erinnert, dessen Werk und Wirken uns Ansporn und Verpflichtung zugleich ist. In diesem Sinne passt dieser Vortrag heute Abend wunderbar auch in unsere Jubiläumsfeierlichkeiten. Wir haben vereinbart, dass Vortrag und anschließende Diskussion so bis maximal 20:45 Uhr sein werden und wir danach die Möglichkeit zum weiteren informellen Austausch bei einem kleinen Empfang im Anschluss haben. Der Vortrag wird in Englisch sein. In der anschließenden Diskussion sind Sie aber ausdrücklich dazu eingeladen, gerne auch Ihre Fragen, Beiträge auf Deutsch zu stellen, sodass wir, glaube ich, eine gute Interaktion in diesem Sinne heute haben werden. Liebe Katja, the floor is yours.
Okay. Vielen tausend Dank erstmal für diese unheimlich freundliche und großzügige Begrüßung. Für mich ist es ganz, ganz toll, hier zu sein. Ich habe gedacht, ich bedanke mich erstmal auf Deutsch und dann fange ich an, auf Englisch zu sprechen. Aber ich möchte als erstes sagen, wie geehrt ich bin, bei dieser Vorlesungsserie mitmachen zu dürfen für das 100-jährige Jubiläum der Hochschule und wie ich mich auch freue, Sie alle zu sehen und auch viele Studenten zu sehen. Ist das Mikrofon so in Ordnung? Okay, gut. Noch kurz was zu trinken eingießen und dann ready to go. Okay, so the title of my talk is Immortality Choiceworthy? And when I was invited to speak at this year-long celebration, I was asked to speak to a topic that in one way or another was going to be suitable. So my hope is that immortality fits the bill. And here's what I'm going to argue. I want to argue that something like immortality figures fundamentally in human motivation and agency. So I will argue that the way in which human beings desire what we see as good is inherently not limited, and that makes an important difference. That is a view that I develop in my book, Desiring the Good, and I defend what I call, or what a lot of people call, the so-called guise of the good account. The guise of the good account says that, sort of most generally, it says that when you are motivated to act, you see the action or something related to the action as good. That is the most basic premise about motivation. Now, today's paper is about what I consider a neglected dimension of this larger proposal. We want what we see as good, and I think that we want it in a way that is not limited. So that is, we want it in a way that does not fit into a finite life. And thus there is a sense in which we want immortality, not because we want to become gods, which we recognize as impossible and which may not even occur to us as a goal. But we want what we see as good in ways that extend beyond our mortal life. My talk is, as Johannes said, an homage to Friedo Ricken, one of the philosophers who shaped, in my view, this institution, in the very best ways. The view about immortality that I will lay out has resonances with Plato's Symposium, and I consider Friedo Ricken a fearless interpreter of the Symposium. Now, what do I mean when I say that he was a fearless interpreter of the Symposium? One might think that the themes in the Symposium, love and desire and immortality, are just too fanciful for analytic philosophers. Important as they are, we may think, well, I'm going to leave that to the poets or to the songwriters or something like that. But Plato does not take that approach, and I think that Friedo Ricken also did not take that approach. If something is important, the thought is we cannot set it aside. So while our theories are in a way in danger of becoming a little bit fanciful when we turn to such topics, we are in even greater danger if we set these topics aside. So the real danger is that our theories fail to capture how things are, and if immortality or something like it is desirable in a way that shapes human agency, then the theory of human action should address it. So consider the question of whether immortality is choiceworthy. One's initial response might be, sure, of course. Immortality is amazing. But philosophers and other thinkers overwhelmingly argue that immortality is not choiceworthy. So my plan is to argue that in some sense, both of these sides are right. What do I mean? I will defend the view that immortality is desirable, and by that I want to pick up on this intuition that immortality is somehow amazing, but not choiceworthy. This proposal involves the claim that immortality is an important topic in the philosophy of action, where the distinction between choiceworthiness and desirability is at home. Now, this may seem surprising. Immortality could seem to be a kind of lofty topic or something, in religion or theology or something like that, rather than a topic in the theory of action. But I argue that the desirability of immortality shapes the structure of human motivation. Now, my argument will involve two thought experiments, one by the 20th century philosopher Bernard Williams, and one by the ancient poet Homer. There is a sizable philosophical debate about Bernard Williams' thought experiment. Now, in my view, that thought experiment misfires in sort of quite fundamental ways, because it is not really about immortality, it is about longevity. It is about biologically stable longevity. But nevertheless, I think it is instructive to think through the thought experiment. By contrast, there is, in my view, not nearly enough contemporary philosophical engagement with Homer's Iliad. The Iliad can be read as an extended thought experiment that compares mortal and immortal life. And that thought experiment, I argue, is also worth thinking through. So, to prepare us for philosophical inquiry on whether immortality is choiceworthy, one kind of, I think, needs a sense of the difficulty of the choice. And that sense is best gained by pretending that one has to make the choice. Hence, I'm going to invite you to vote. So the question you're going to be voting on is, would you choose immortality? Yes or no, those will be the options. So, yes, immortality is choiceworthy, no, it isn't. But to give you a moment to make up your mind, here are some brief clarifications. Now, these clarifications only scratch the surface. Ultimately, it is kind of rather unclear what immortality even amounts to, especially if it is imagined that a human being is immortal. But I will postpone some of these difficulties. So a few remarks while you think your way into the issue. First, by way of introduction, I already mentioned a somewhat technical distinction in the philosophy of action. One kind of desiderative attitude, often called wish, is not confined to what is possible. You can want or wish for the impossible. But there is another set of desiderative attitudes that is confined to the possible. We do not deliberate and make decisions or choices. So decision and choice are here used as sort of synonymous. We do not deliberate or make choices about the impossible. That is a famous Aristotelian premise in the philosophy of action that is accepted by pretty much everyone until today. Aristotle's example is that we do not deliberate about whether to become a god, because we know that we cannot become a god. But we could wish to be immortal. So that's the difference between wish on the one hand and choice, and deliberation on the other hand. So that means that when we vote on is immortality choiceworthy, you should understand the question as follows. If you were in a scenario where you could choose immortality, what would you choose? In other words, our starting point is counterfactual. Otherwise, the question of whether immortality is choiceworthy doesn't even make sense. So for the purposes of voting, just think about the question of whether immortality is choiceworthy, with the stipulation that you are in a scenario where that is an option, which in fact you're not, but you sort of pretend you can choose it. So here's the second clarification. When I ask whether immortality is choiceworthy, I don't mean to ask whether it would be choiceworthy to have an immortal soul. Throughout the centuries, many people have hoped or believed that they have an immortal soul, or that the mind is immortal, or something like that. By contrast, my question is not about the soul, it's not about the mind, it is about us, about human beings. It envisages an overtly counterfactual scenario, that instead of being mortal, you're immortal. And it invites us to imagine that we are humans, but altered in just that one specific respect, we are not mortal. So, the third clarification. In the choice that we imagine, immortality would eliminate the biological process of aging. Now, here's why we need that clarification. Mortality, of course, does not just consist in the fact of death. Being mortal is being such that we get older and change over time, such that eventually we die. So for the question of whether immortality is choiceworthy, to have a grip, in the sense in which a thought experiment can have a grip, we either need to stipulate that we are biologically ageless, or that the process of biological aging would be stopped at the point where we choose immortality. Now, there's an ancient story in a Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, where someone wishes for immortality and is granted the wish, but forgot to wish that he doesn't age biologically, and he comes to regret that. So you need to stipulate that you are at a given biological age, one that you like, and at that point you choose immortality, which somehow involves that you're not going to age any further. Okay, those are my preliminary clarifications, and now comes the first vote. There's going to be another vote later on, but this is only your preliminary vote. So who, including people up there, who thinks that immortality is choiceworthy? And who votes that it isn't choiceworthy? I would say, I didn't look in your, like, please, I want to see again what people up there were voting. Did anyone vote that it isn't choiceworthy up there? Okay, thank you. So I think maybe somewhat more people voted that it isn't choiceworthy, but it almost seems to me as if maybe some people voted twice. So, but that's fine. Okay, so to think about this further, consider a thought experiment that Bernard Williams, an influential 20th century philosopher, introduced. So that is widely debated. Williams invokes a figure from an opera called The Macropolis Affair, and the person is called Elena Macropolis. She was born in the 16th century. She is 42 years of age when she drinks a potion. From now on, she stops getting older. Over the centuries, she creates different personas for herself, suitable to the different eras in which she lives. Throughout all this time, she has one goal. She wants to be a first-rate singer. Now, the potion works for 300 years. After 300 years, she has the choice to drink the potion again, but at that moment, at the age of 342, she decides against it. She chooses to die because her immortal life has become boring. That is Williams' sort of famous claim that her life becomes boring. Now, here's what the Elena case shows according to Bernard Williams. One would not choose immortality. Let me highlight 3 dimensions of this proposal. First, Williams argues that the range of experiences that could, quote unquote, make sense to a person of such and such a character is limited. So given who you are, the range of experiences that would make sense to you, that's limited. And hence, immortal life would become boring because the variety of experiences that make sense for you as one person, given who you are, that variety is limited. Second, Williams introduces what he calls categorical desires. Categorical desires are, as he defines them, what propel you forward in life, what gives you, as it were proverbially speaking, a reason to live. Now, presumably, after 300 years of existence, a person no longer has categorical desires, desires which provide her with a reason to live. Third, and that is maybe the strongest claim, Williams proposes that immortality necessarily becomes boring. It is not a contingent fact about Elena that she comes to be bored. Rather, anyone would find immortality boring. That is the claim. So That's a very strong claim. It's not saying, for some people it would become boring. Necessarily, immortality would become boring. That is the claim. Now, any number of philosophers have taken issue with Williams' arguments, and the best known objections, I think, concern premises about personal identity. They address how memory figures in character and thereby in personal identity. The thought is that memories fade and decay, so, Elina just won't recall all of the experiences that she has had over the centuries, and if she doesn't recall them, she can have the same ones again, and they are going to be new to her. So, at any given time, some experiences are new to her, and she need not be bored. So, and as her set of memories evolves, she may not even be one persistent person throughout the, centuries. That is one kind of challenge. And in effect, Williams' premise that Elina has a given stable character with given stable categorical desires may not be compelling. Another line of objection asks whether immortality would make us kind of listless, undermotivated, almost to the extent that we are paralyzed. This is, for example, Martha Nussbaum's position. Without the finitude of human life she holds, a person may not be able to do anything. She thinks that, you could always postpone, so you're not going to do anything. You would be not pushed to make a decision if there is no kind of awareness of the finitude of your life. For now, I want to set all these debates aside. Instead, I turn to what I take away from Williams' thought experiment. And I'm going to have sort of two sets of considerations, and one is about human agency and motivation. So consider again what Elina's goal is, as it is described. She wants to be a masterful musician, a stellar, amazing, perfect singer. And in order to attain that, she thinks she needs more time. That is why she drinks the potion. And eventually, she attains her artistic goals. The reason that her categorical desires can be exhausted lies in that structure. There's one specific goal that she has. And that goal is hard to attain, but it is attainable. Hence, it makes sense that once that goal is attained, Elina no longer wants to prolong her life. So my question is that really what human pursuits are like? Do you have one goal that is in principle attainable just by yourself in your own life? So against that kind of picture, I want to suggest that many things that we want are not obviously attainable, and nevertheless they shape our motivations. Think of ideals that people pursue, ideals like justice or like the improvement of the law or something like that. Or inventions that people work on. Think how many centuries or millennia it took people to invent planes to fly, and people have sort of wanted to fly since antiquity, but they were crashing, so eventually it worked. So it looks to me as if a lot of things that people want and work on and put a lot of energy into are not obviously attainable within the confines of a given life. They involve the lives and actions of other people, and often over generations. Williams wants to draw a lesson about a necessary feature of human motivation, but the case he starts out with doesn't, to me, seem to be typical for human agency. And more on that later. So here's another set of considerations, and that is about the notion of immortality. As I see it, Williams does not succeed at conjuring up a scenario that permits inferences about our relationship to immortality. As intriguing as the Elina scenario is, it fails to capture a key dimension of immortality. Here's a kind of metaphysical point. Anything which has a beginning, such as Elina's life, cannot count as immortal. That is, that's the kind of premise that you will find in early Greek philosophy and from then on. Immortality must stretch out into both directions, past and future. This is too basic a feature of immortality to be set aside, even in a thought experiment. And since this feature is not preserved in the Elena scenario, Williams, in fact, asks a different question from the one that is the title of my talk. He asks whether a certain kind of longevity, where we don't grow biologically older, is choiceworthy. Now, once we redescribe the thought experiment as being about this biologically stable longevity, it seems clear to me what the answer is. Sure, biologically stable longevity can be choiceworthy. And I emphasize can, so I'm not making the necessity claim that Williams makes, saying it can be choiceworthy. For how long? Well, that depends, I guess, on the person and on any number of features of her life. That upshot seems plausible, but it elucidates how we relate to aging and to the typical length of a human life, not how we relate to immortality. So, with this, I turn to Homer. Ancient philosophers tend to view Homer as a deep thinker about philosophical questions. And I think they are right in that. In Homer's Iliad, Greeks and Trojans fight against each other. The gods are involved in any number of ways. They instigate the war, they take sides, and so on. So one reading of the poem considers it as an extended thought experiment. The Iliad invites us to compare human with immortal life. This dimension of the Iliad is nicely captured in the movie Troy. So this is a dimension of the Iliad that has not escaped like filmmakers in Hollywood. So it is a very prominent dimension of the Iliad. So there's a scene in that, like if you've seen that movie, there's a scene in that movie where, and that scene is sort of captures very, very well what's going on in the poem, where Achilles, that is like one of the heroes and leaders on the side of the Greeks, he talks with a captured princess from Troy, whose name is Briseis, and Briseis is badly hurt and finds herself in a terrible condition and violated in so many ways, including in her role as a priestess of Apollo. So in the face of her reverence for divinity, Achilles says to her, it is the other way around. The gods envy us. The gods envy us because nothing that they do has any real significance. Ultimately, nothing matters because they are invulnerable. They meddle with the affairs of humans, take sides in wars, and so on, in order to find things to care about. When divine and human life intersect, so for example, Zeus at some point is tempted to save one of his sons from death in battle. He has a son with a mortal woman, and so he wants to interfere and save him. And at that moment, something like the urgency and importance that characterize human life come up. For a moment, Zeus cares deeply. But then he remembers his place as Zeus, and he returns to his immortal mindset. According to the Homeric thought experiment, then, invulnerability to death means that nothing really matters. In other words, immortal lives are bare of meaning. Philosophers who work on meaning have argued that for our lives to be meaningful for us, two conditions must be met. We must care deeply about something, and we must care about something that really is, actually, genuinely worthwhile. This line of thought has been famously defended by Susan Wolf, and it explains why the lives of our Homeric immortals are not meaningful. So suppose two gods are mad at each other, which, if you read the Iliad, that happens all the time. So two gods are mad at each other in their divine circles. However, nothing follows. They fight, they betray each other, and so on and so forth. Well, and then they get together at the next divine banquet. Since they are invulnerable and immortal, they cannot really harm each other. Whatever they do, it comes to nothing. To get beyond this, the gods need humans. Via their half-divine children, they can be invested in the drama of human life. They can take sides in wars, and so on. But the meaning that the gods derive from us is derivative. It is second-hand meaning. Their own lives don't have meaning precisely because they cannot lose their lives. Thus, people have argued, in a sense, the meaning of life seems to depend on mortality. Now, does it follow that you would prefer to be Penelope, that is Odysseus' mortal wife, rather than immortal Athena? Or that you would prefer to be the hero Achilles rather than the god Apollo? Probably not. Presumably, immortality plus second-hand meaning is still better than mortality. The Iliad suggests that the gods need derivative meaning to entertain themselves, but it does not suggest that, therefore, immortality isn't desirable. On the contrary, it is what Homeric heroes want more than anything else. With regard to Williams's thought experiment, this raises a question about the criterion that should be employed. Perhaps it doesn't matter that much whether we would be bored. Perhaps immortality is just inherently such a great thing that, boredom or not, we would want it. So perhaps we shouldn't think, if I were bored, then it isn't choiceworthy. So that roughly is the picture in the Iliad, sort of boredom or not, immortality, amazing. Now, while Achilles recognizes that the gods need the drama of human life to entertain them, he fights for immortal fame. This is presented as it were, desiring a surrogate version of immortality. In the Homeric comparison between mortals and immortals, each side is locked into its condition, and each side's life seems shaped by its relation to the other. The gods would die of boredom if they didn't have human affairs to care about. But humans are also not content within the confines of their lives. They look towards immortality as inherently desirable, and that shapes how they go about their pursuits. The upshot is a proposal about human motivation. We desire immortality even though it is impossible for us. That is the proposal that Plato engages with in the Symposium. The Symposium is sort of full of explicit references to the Iliad. Now, assuming you voted that immortality is choiceworthy, you probably did not think of the petty fights among the Greek gods. By way of introduction, I said that immortality seems amazing. It seems to be something lofty, elevated, grand. And if that is the intuition, we need to rethink probably our notion of divinity, if we are readers of Homer, as the Greek philosophers do. None of them accepts the traditional gods as Homer and Hesiod describe them. The Greek philosophers stipulate that whatever is true about divinity, it is good. That premise has shaped the Abrahamic traditions and is likely to inform how most of us today think of immortality. But a modified theology, where divinity is truly admirable, only reinforces the upshot of Homer's comparison. Immortality seems desirable, but if it is real immortality, it is the state of fundamentally different beings. So a philosophical account of our relation to immortality thus faces sort of severe challenges. It should recognize that immortality is not a choice for us. And nevertheless, it may be that it is desirable for us. Now, recall the distinction between choiceworthiness and desirability that I mentioned earlier. It is not possible to choose something that is impossible, but it's certainly possible to wish for and desire something that is impossible. So that gets us to our second vote. So, get ready. Should we say that immortality is desirable but not choiceworthy? If immortality is desirable, this may have significant implications for the structure of human motivation. And the final part of my talk will sketch these implications. But first we need our second vote. So as before, the implications of these kinds of questions often only become salient if you sort of try to make up your own mind. What do I think? Then the question becomes more urgent. And to give you a moment to consider your second vote, let me restate the difference between choiceworthiness and desirability. Choice is limited by the possible, desire is not. It is possible for something to be desirable, even if you cannot choose it. Immortality is desirable if the intuition that it is somehow amazing doesn't go away no matter what Williams and Homer's thought experiments suggest. Okay. Vote. Is immortality desirable? If you say yes, raise your hand. I feel like I'm not seeing what people over there are voting. And now, okay, thank you. And now if you vote against it, if you vote that immortality is not desirable, now I know why no one raised their hand, because you actually, all of you hold the other view. Thank you. Interesting. So this is very split. Now, in recent decades, philosophers revived insights from Aristotle's theory of action and motivation, and really kind of most of today's philosophy of action started with Elizabeth Anscombe reviving these Aristotelian ideas in the 1950s, and philosophy of action is a sort of thoroughly Aristotelian field. And throughout this talk, I have invoked some of the relevant premises, such as the idea that one cannot deliberate about the impossible and that there is an important difference between choice and wish. Now, again, the former is tied to the constraints of what is possible, the latter is not. And I want to add, and even though I've said this now a couple times, it is a difficult idea. So I want to add a few more examples to illustrate the distinction. My main example so far was this: we cannot choose to be immortal because it is impossible to become immortal, but one can desire immortality. Second example, one cannot decide to be healthy. You can't make a decision, I'm going to decide to be healthy. Doesn't work. But you can certainly wish to be healthy. Third example, you cannot decide to be happy, but you can certainly desire to be happy. Fourth example, one cannot decide to fly, but one can wish that one could fly. All of these four examples are widely debated with respect to choice, the notion of choice. Why is it that choice is limited to the possible? But the examples are much less widely debated with a view to wish and desire for the impossible. And the upshot of my argument is that that is a mistake. Deliberation and choice are basic dimensions of human motivation, but so is desire and wish. So suppose that many of you voted that immortality is desirable, or at least that many of you weren't quite sure, how to vote and didn't want to describe immortality as undesirable. So why would one have this thought while one recognizes that immortality is impossible to have? I suspect that two ideas are at work. One of these ideas is about divinity. If we think that immortality is what divinity has, well, and if we think that divinity is good, it may seem that we should also say that immortality is good. That seems plausible to me, but I will set it aside, and I will sort of leave that to others who work in the philosophy of religion. The other idea, which is my own focus, relates to human motivation. It says that typical human pursuits do not fit into any one human life. This is most evident in people like Achilles. Achilles, this hero from the Greek side, most famous Greek warrior. Achilles fought for immortal fame. And as far as we can tell, several thousand years later, he was pretty successful, so he is still famous. Elina's goal can also be recast in these terms. Perhaps she doesn't just want excellence as a singer, as something that she attains in her own life. Others will hear her, and their lives will be shaped by that experience. Thus, there is a sense in which her art is going to survive her. Now, setting war heroes and artists aside, it may seem that typical and widespread human pursuits have the same structure. Raising children is probably the most widespread way of extending one's life into the future. Building things, improving laws, research in the sciences, inventing things are further examples. Plato argues, and I have defended a similar view in my own work, that this is a distinctive and pervasive feature of human motivation. What we want extends beyond our own lives. Now, Plato describes this as a mortal form of immortality. Now, that may sound too metaphorical and fanciful for our purposes as philosophers today, but it can be rephrased in terms that are less fanciful. The most basic feature of human motivation, so much is widely agreed among people working in the philosophy of action, is that we desire what we see as good. That is the so-called guise of the good. But goodness does not come in neat little packages. When we want what is good, we don't just want a bit of it. We want what we see as good, period. The primary object of desire here is the good, not immortality. The idea that immortality is desirable comes up, as it were, in order to make sense of the nature of desire for the good. One also has to desire something like immortality, some kind of extension of one's life, to make place for extended goodness. The proposal is that this inherently extends our perspective beyond our lives. To use again the most familiar example, having children and wanting them to grow up well. Parents don't typically want their children to do well just as long as they, the parents, are around. They want them to do well also when they themselves have passed away. Here's another example. Suppose someone studies some chemical process in the hopes that their students and the students of their students will be able to translate these results into effective medical treatment. These ways of being motivated are not fanciful. They are utterly at home in everyday life. They do not involve the choice of immortality, which we all recognize would be futile. But they involve a desire for something good about our lives to outlive us. And thus they involve something like a kind of desire for what we may call a surrogate of immortality. In Plato's terms, a human kind of immortality. Now, if this is compelling, it means that standard approaches in the philosophy of action miss something fairly basic. They focus too much on choice, on decision-making, and thereby on that which right here and now is possible, and too little on wish and desire, which are not limited by what is possible within one human life. The challenge of characterizing human motivation in a compelling way is to integrate how the confines of what is possible here and now interact with desire for that which here and now is impossible. The proposal is that the latter transforms the former. What pursuits we typically choose is shaped by our wish for ongoing and unending goodness. We choose pursuits that propel whatever is good about our lives beyond them into the future. Formulated in this manner, the proposal still retains a bit of the fanciful atmosphere that a discussion of immortality is bound to have, but only a bit. It recognizes that human motivation and agency are shaped by the fact that our lives are finite. It engages with immortality only to the extent that it also recognizes that what we typically want does not fit into one finite life. Thank you.